You've always been the strong one, Margaret. But right now, you're just holding everything back. Frank said those words to me 3 days after my oncologist confirmed the diagnosis. I was sitting at our kitchen table in the house we had shared for 22 years, still wearing the same blouse I had worn to the appointment, my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold an hour before. He was standing at the counter with his back half turned to me, scrolling through his phone, and when he finally looked up, his expression was not the one of a man whose wife had just been told she had cancer. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to say something and had finally found the right opening. I did not respond. I had spent 31 years as a school principal learning how to stay perfectly still when a situation required it, so I simply set down my mug, looked at my husband of 22 years, and nodded once. But inside, something fundamental shifted. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If this story is touching something you recognize, something you have felt in your own life or in someone close to you, please subscribe to our channel. There is more coming that you will not want to miss. My name is Margaret Calloway. I am 63 years old, and until 11 months ago, I believed my marriage was solid. Not perfect, no marriage is, but solid. Frank and I had built what looked, from every angle, like a good life. We lived in a craftsman-style home in Ashford, a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, that I had helped redesign after we bought it during our 5th year of marriage. We had a daughter, Claire, who was 30 and living in Portland. We had savings, investments, a shared financial history that stretched back to before cell phones were common. After I retired from the school district, I had built a small but respected private education consulting firm, helping families navigate college placement and learning disability resources throughout Central Ohio. I was busy, purposeful, and under the comfortable illusion that Frank and I were partners. The cancer was a DCIS diagnosis, stage 1, caught early by a routine mammogram I had almost canceled. My oncologist, Dr. Miriam Walsh, was encouraging from the first conversation. "We caught this early, Margaret. Your treatment options are excellent. Lumpectomy, followed by radiation, possibly a short course of hormone therapy. Your prognosis is very good." She said those words clearly, calmly, and with the kind of professional warmth that I imagined she had cultivated over years of delivering complicated news. I cried in her office, not from fear of dying, though that was present in some background register, but from the sudden, disorienting recognition that my body had been quietly carrying something I knew nothing about. Frank drove me to that appointment and sat in the waiting room the entire time. When I came out and told him, he pulled me into a hug that lasted exactly long enough to feel sincere. He asked the right questions when we spoke to the nurse coordinator afterward. He was attentive through dinner. And then, 3 days later, standing at our kitchen counter, he said I was holding everything back. I did not ask him to explain. I already understood. Frank had been a real estate attorney for over 3 decades. He was precise, methodical, and accustomed to framing difficult realities in language that sounded reasonable. What he meant, and what I understood clearly from the tone beneath his words, was that my cancer was an inconvenience to a plan he had already been forming. I did not know the full shape of that plan yet, but I had spent enough years reading people, teachers who were burning out, parents who were hiding their children's struggles, administrators who were quietly preparing to push someone out, to recognize when someone was positioning themselves before delivering news. That night, after Frank fell asleep watching television in the den, I went to my home office and opened my laptop. I am not sure what I was initially looking for. Perhaps I was simply trying to occupy my hands and my mind while my emotions settled. I opened our shared financial folder, the one we had maintained since the early years of our marriage, the one that held account statements, property documents, investment portfolios, and the estate plan we had updated 7 years ago when Claire graduated college. I had not reviewed these documents in over a year. Frank handled the financial side of our life. I had always trusted him to do so. He was an attorney, after all. He understood these things better than I did. What I found over the next 2 hours did not make complete sense to me at the time, but it unsettled me deeply enough that I created a separate folder on my desktop and began saving screenshots. 3 investment accounts that I remembered as jointly held had been quietly restructured. A certificate of deposit that had been in both our names, originally funded by my inheritance from my father's estate, now showed Frank listed as sole owner. There was a series of transfers over the previous 8 months, modest enough individually not to trigger any alarm, but consistent enough in direction to suggest intention. Everything was moving toward accounts I recognized as Frank's personal holdings, the ones he had maintained separately since before our marriage. I sat in my office until 2 in the morning. Then I closed the laptop, went to the bedroom, and lay awake beside my husband while he slept soundly, watching the ceiling and thinking about every conversation we had not had. The following Monday, while Frank was at his firm, I called my friend Carol Dempsey. Carol and I had been close since our first year in the Columbus School District, back when we were both young teachers sharing a supply closet. She had retired from the district 2 years before me, and now spent most of her time gardening and advocating loudly for things she believed in, which had always been one of her most endearing qualities. She answered on the second ring. "I need your help with something," I told her. "Something I cannot talk about over the phone." She arrived at my house 45 minutes later with a container of soup she had apparently had warming on the stove when I called, because that was exactly the kind of person Carol was. I showed her what I had found. She was quiet for a long time, which was not like her. Then she said, "You need to call someone who understands this better than either of us." I already had a name in mind. Patricia Weston had been one of the mothers in my school community years ago, bright and methodical, who had gone back to law school in her 40s and built a family law practice in downtown Columbus with a reputation for protecting women in complicated financial situations. I had referred several families to her over the years for matters that had nothing to do with divorce. I called her office that afternoon and left a message. She called back within the hour. She agreed to meet me Thursday at her office. She suggested I bring whatever documentation I had gathered. She said everything we discussed would be strictly confidential. That evening at dinner, Frank mentioned, in passing, that he thought it might be a good time for me to step back from my consulting work. "Just temporarily," he said, passing the bread without looking at me. "You have treatment coming up, Margaret. You need to focus on yourself. The business can wait." I agreed pleasantly, said that was probably wise, and asked if he wanted more salad. He did. I had been in education long enough to know that the most dangerous conversations are not the ones that become arguments. They are the ones where both people say the right words while meaning entirely different things. Frank thought he was managing me. I was already gathering evidence. Thursday came, and I drove myself downtown. Patricia Weston's office was on the 14th floor of a building near the State House. Modest, and organized in a way that communicated quiet competence. She was in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the kind of measured attention that I immediately found reassuring. After I explained the situation and walked her through the documents I had printed and brought in a folder, she was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. Then she said, "Margaret, some of what you have described is concerning, and some of it may have legitimate explanations, but the pattern is worth examining carefully. Especially given the timing." I asked what she meant by timing. She looked at me directly. "The restructuring of those accounts appears to have begun approximately 14 months ago. That is 2 months before your diagnosis, which suggests this was not a reaction to your medical situation." The observation settled over me like cold water. She went on, "Ohio is an equitable distribution state. In the event of divorce, marital assets are divided fairly based on contribution and circumstances. Your inheritance from your father, if it was commingled with joint accounts during your marriage, may be considered marital property. However, if it was moved to a solely held account without your knowledge or consent, that raises different legal questions." She paused. "What I can tell you is that you have grounds to request a full financial disclosure and an independent accounting." I asked about my consulting business. It was mine, built after my retirement, though I had occasionally discussed strategy with Frank and used our shared home office space. "Your business is yours," she said. "As long as Frank has not invested in it or been listed in its formation documents, it is protected as separate property. I strongly recommend we verify this and establish that protection formally, regardless of what you decide to do about your marriage." I told her I had not decided anything yet. I was still processing. She nodded with understanding that felt genuine. "You do not have to decide anything today, but you should know your position, and you should stop sharing financial access with your husband until we have a clearer picture of what has been moved and why." I drove home with the windows down despite the October chill, needing the cold air to help me think. That night, I sat again at my laptop. This time, I was more specific in what I was looking for. I pulled up the account that had held my father's inheritance, the one he left me when he passed 6 years ago. It had been $112,000, money I had deposited into what was then our joint savings account because it had felt natural and right at the time. It had felt like the thing a person did when they were truly partnered with someone. The current balance of that account was $11,000. I did not sleep that night either. But by 3 a.m, I had done several things. I had changed the password on my consulting business's financial accounts. I had moved my personal documents, including my passport, my original Social Security card, and the deed to a small piece of land in rural Kentucky that had been willed to me separately by my grandmother and had never been commingled with anything, to Carol's house. And I had drafted an email to Patricia Weston with a list of every discrepancy I had found, organized by date and account number. Then I opened our joint estate plan and read it carefully for the first time in years. Under its current terms, everything passed to Frank in the event of my death. Given what I was now beginning to understand, this was no longer acceptable. Patricia had a colleague who specialized in estate planning. I emailed her to ask for a referral. She responded the next morning with a name and a note that said, "I saw your attached list. Call me before you do anything else. We need to coordinate this properly." I called her from my car in the driveway, engine running, so Frank would not overhear. She spoke for 20 minutes. I listened carefully. By the time she finished, I had a clear sequence of steps in front of me. Over the next week, I moved with the deliberate patience that 31 years of school administration had given me. I requested copies of every joint account statement going back 3 years from our bank, presenting myself as a co-owner, reviewing records for tax preparation, which was entirely true and raised no questions. I met again with Patricia and with her estate planning colleague, David Huang, a quiet man with an encyclopedic knowledge of Ohio probate law. I had my business formally evaluated and its separate property status documented, and I amended my personal estate documents to redirect my assets away from Frank and toward Claire and an education access fund I had been informally supporting for years. Frank continued to mention, every few days, that I should think about winding down my client list. He said it with concern in his voice. He brought home brochures about a wellness retreat in Scottsdale that he thought might help me prepare mentally for treatment. He was, on the surface, attentive. And the more attentive he was, the colder and more precise I became on the inside. Claire called me every other day. She did not know what I was uncovering, but she had always been perceptive, and something in my voice must have shifted because on one particular Thursday evening she asked quietly, "Mom, is everything okay with you and Dad?" I told her I was processing a lot. I told her the diagnosis had brought things into focus that I had been soft about for a long time. She did not press me further, but before she hung up she said, "I'm on your side. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that." I had to set the phone down for a moment after that. The week before I was scheduled to begin radiation treatment, Frank came home from work with what he described as a business matter to discuss. He sat across from me at the dining room table with a folder of documents and a tone he used when presenting things to clients that he expected to approve without much scrutiny. He explained that he had been working with a financial advisor to consolidate some of our holdings into a more streamlined structure, more efficient for estate purposes, he said, especially given your situation. He slid the folder across to me. I opened it and read it carefully, slowly, without expression. What he was asking me to sign would have transferred the last significant jointly held investment account into a trust structure that named him as sole trustee with discretionary control over distributions. The language was crafted to appear protective, but Patricia had already explained to me, in our second meeting, exactly what this kind of structure meant in practice. It meant that if I signed those papers, I would have no independent access to those funds without his approval. I closed the folder. I said I would like to have my attorney review it before signing anything. Frank's expression did not change immediately. That small delay before he responded told me everything about how surprised he was. "Your attorney," he said finally. "You mean Patricia Weston?" I had mentioned her name only once, casually, weeks earlier, claiming I had consulted her about a contract matter for my business. The fact that he remembered her name immediately told me he had looked her up. I said yes, and that I would be in touch with his timeline after she had a chance to review. He said he thought we could handle this between ourselves without making it complicated. I said, calmly, that it was already complicated, Frank. He left for a run after dinner. I sat on the back porch in the October evening, wrapped in a cardigan, listening to the neighbors' wind chimes 2 houses over, and felt something settle in me that had been churning for weeks. Not peace exactly. More like clarity reaching its final form. The formal meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days later, in Patricia's conference room. Frank brought his law partner, a man named Gerald Storr, who had been with Frank's firm for 15 years. I sat beside Patricia and David Huang, with Carol waiting in the lobby because I had asked her to be nearby and she had not questioned this for a single second. Gerald opened by describing the proposed trust restructuring as a standard estate planning measure appropriate for a couple in our situation, by which he meant a couple with one spouse facing a serious medical situation, and suggested that any concerns I had were likely based on a misunderstanding of the document's intent. Patricia did not raise her voice. She simply placed 3 years of account statements on the table, organized chronologically, and asked Frank to explain the pattern of transfers. There was a long silence. Frank looked at the documents the way I had seen certain parents look at a disciplinary report about their child, the particular expression of someone who had believed the evidence would never actually be presented in a room. Gerald suggested the transfers reflected legitimate financial management decisions made during a period of market uncertainty. Patricia asked specifically about the certificate of deposit originally funded by my father's inheritance. Another silence, longer this time. Frank said the account had been restructured as part of a broader consolidation. I asked, speaking for the first time since introductions, whether that restructuring had been discussed with me at any point, whether I had been informed or consulted before my inheritance was moved to an account in your name alone. He said he had made the decision in what he believed were our best interests. I said that answering a different question than the one I had asked was something I had spent years teaching middle schoolers not to do. Carol told me later that she had heard laughter through the conference room wall at that point, and she had not been sure whether it was appropriate to feel relieved. What followed over the next 2 hours was a thorough and often uncomfortable accounting of our finances. Frank's composure eroded gradually as Patricia and David moved through their prepared documents with methodical precision. By the midpoint of the meeting, Gerald had stopped interjecting and was instead leaning close to Frank and speaking in low, urgent tones. What emerged was this. Frank had been moving assets systematically for over a year. Not all of it could be explained by financial management. Some of the cash withdrawals that Patricia had flagged had no corresponding business entries in Frank's firm accounts. When Patricia asked about these directly, Frank's answer was vague in a way that experienced attorneys do not allow themselves to be by accident. I did not ask him outright whether there was another person involved. I had decided, after many nights of thinking it through, that the answer to that particular question did not change my decisions. What changed my decisions was the pattern of financial behavior, the deliberate exclusion from choices that affected my life, and the words he had said to me at the kitchen table 3 days after my diagnosis. What I said instead, at the point in the meeting when formal positions had been clearly established and everyone in the room understood that we were no longer discussing an estate planning adjustment, was this. Frank, I have been trying to understand at what point I stopped being your partner and started being a liability you were planning around. I have not been able to find a single moment where it happened, which makes me think it was gradual, and that I simply was not paying close enough attention. He started to respond. I continued. I am not interested in a lengthy legal battle. I am interested in what is fair, and in protecting what belongs to me, so that I can focus on my health and my work. If you approach this the same way, we can end this marriage with some dignity intact. If you do not, Patricia and David have made it very clear to me that I have a strong position. Gerald put his hand on Frank's arm. Frank looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. There was something in it that might have been regret, or it might have been the particular look of a careful man recalculating. He said he needed time to consult with his counsel. I said that was fine, and that Patricia would be in touch regarding the formal separation agreement and full financial disclosure. We did not speak again in that room. Carol had coffee waiting for me in the lobby. She handed me the cup without saying anything, which was the most comforting response she could have offered. In the car on the way home, she finally spoke. "Are you okay?" I thought about the question seriously before answering. "I am exactly as okay as I expected to be," I told her, which is not the same as fine, but it is enough. I started radiation treatment the following Monday. Dr. Walsh's team was warm and efficient. The sessions were brief and the side effects manageable. I had read extensively about what to expect, and having accurate information had always been the thing that kept me functional when situations were difficult. I went to my appointments alone, not because I had no one to take me, but because I found the solitude in the waiting room useful. It gave me time to think, to plan, to read on my phone, to simply exist in my own company, without narrating my experience for anyone else's comfort. Frank and I were living in the same house during this period, a situation that was awkward and occasionally painful, and that we both managed with the particular coldness of two intelligent people who have decided to be professional about something devastating. He moved to the guest room without discussion. We ate separately. We communicated by text about logistical matters. Claire flew in from Portland for the second week of my treatment. She stayed for 10 days, slept on the pull-out sofa in my office, and drove me to every appointment. She did not say much about Frank. I think she understood more than I had told her. On her last evening before her flight back, she sat beside me on the back porch and said, "I am so proud of you, Mom. Not just for handling all of this, for being the kind of person who handles things." I told her I had learned most of it from watching her become exactly who she was, which was the truth. The formal divorce proceedings took 4 months. Frank's financial disclosures, compelled through the legal process, confirmed what Patricia had suspected. A significant portion of the transferred assets had been moved in preparation for a situation he had been privately planning for some time. Some of the unexplained cash withdrawals were connected to a down payment on a condominium in a building I had never heard of. I will leave the full shape of that particular discovery to your imagination, because the specific details matter less than the general architecture of the betrayal. Ohio's equitable distribution laws, Patricia had told me early on, looked favorably on my position, given the length of the marriage, my contributions to our shared financial life, and the demonstrable evidence of asset movement without my consent. My father's inheritance, even though it had been commingled, was recoverable, in large part given the documented circumstances. My consulting business was protected entirely as separate property. The settlement was not everything I had hoped for, but it was everything I needed. I bought a house the month after the divorce was finalized. A single-story ranch on a quiet street in a neighborhood called Maplewood, about 4 miles from the craftsman home I had lived in for 2 decades. It was smaller, lighter, with a screened porch off the back, and a kitchen that faced east and filled with morning sun. I spent a weekend painting the living room a color that I had always liked and that Frank had always considered too bold. I planted a raised garden bed along the south fence with Carol's help one Saturday afternoon in March, and we worked for 4 hours and talked about everything except the divorce, which was exactly what I needed. My consulting business had not stopped during any of this. I had kept my client commitments through treatment and proceedings both, scaling carefully to protect my energy but never disappearing entirely. Vanessa, a former assistant principal I had mentored who had joined my firm the previous year, carried more of the operational load during the difficult months and did so with a competence that reminded me every week why I had asked her to come on board. By spring, we were fielding more inquiries than we could accept. I restructured the business formally in April, bringing Vanessa in as a partner. We redesigned our service model to allow for more remote consultation, which expanded our geographic reach significantly. Within 6 months, we were working with families in 8 states. The accessibility of the new model, which I had initially adopted out of necessity during my recovery, turned out to be one of the most valuable professional decisions I had ever made. Dr. Walsh cleared me from active treatment in late spring with a follow-up schedule and the kind of careful optimism that I had come to appreciate about her. She said recovery from radiation was individual and that I should not compare my timeline to anyone else's. I told her that was excellent advice for almost every situation in life. She laughed and said she might put that on her wall. My father's pearl brooch, the one Frank had claimed was in a drawer somewhere when I had asked about it during the separation period, was returned to me by his attorney at the conclusion of the settlement process along with several other small items I had itemized. I held it for a long time after it arrived, My father had given it to my mother on their 40th anniversary. She had pressed it into my hand at her kitchen table the summer before she passed, saying, "Keep this where you can see it. Not to look pretty, to remember." I put it on the small shelf above my east-facing kitchen window. Every morning when I make coffee, I can see it catch the light. There is a particular freedom that comes not from achieving something extraordinary, but from stopping the performance of a version of yourself that was never quite accurate. I had been Frank's wife for 22 years, and I had been good at it. Genuinely good at the partnership and the home and the social world we occupied together. But there had always been a layer beneath the surface of that life that I had smoothed over instead of examined. Accommodations I had made so gradually I had stopped noticing I was making them. I noticed them now, in their absence. At 63, I am not rebuilding from zero. I am building from something better than zero, which is a clear understanding of what I actually am. I am a woman who ran a school for 31 years, who built a consulting practice from nothing, who got a cancer diagnosis and a financial betrayal in the same season, and addressed both of them with the same methodical determination. I am someone who has Carol and Claire and a screened porch and a raised garden bed and a kitchen full of morning light. I am someone who no longer holds back anything worth keeping. Some mornings I sit with my coffee and think about that moment at the kitchen table, Frank standing at the counter, my hands around a cold mug, the words just holding everything back, landing in the air between us. I do not feel the sting of it the way I did at first. What I feel now is something closer to gratitude, the uncomfortable, unsentimental kind. He showed me, in one unguarded sentence, exactly what the terrain of my life had become, and because he did, I had the chance to change it. The paperwork I signed that night, the first steps toward protecting what was mine, was the beginning, not of a revenge story, of a reckoning. Of finally understanding that my value was never something another person could assess or remove. It was mine all along, sitting quietly inside me through every accommodation and every glossed-over warning sign, waiting for the moment I decided to act as if I knew it. I know it now. I do not look back with anger anymore. I look back the way you look back from the top of a difficult trail, not to dwell on the hard parts, but to understand the full distance you have traveled and what it took to get here.